I am not fragile. I just forgot I was dangerous. That's what I told myself the night my son placed a folding cot beside the water heater and said, "It's only temporary, Ma. You'll be fine in here for a while." He smiled like it was kindness, but the garage didn't lie. It smelled of oil, metal, and forgotten things. A place for storage, not people. My name is Lorraine Taylor. I am 76 years old. I used to run the front desk at the Orange County Courthouse for over 4 decades. People knew me for my steel, pressed blouses and sharper memory. My voice was what made lawyers straighten their backs before walking into court. I filed motions blindfolded and spotted typos in restraining orders faster than the judges who signed them. That was then. Now, I was in a folding chair with a blanket so thin I could read the stitching. I was in my son's garage. Let me rewind. 3 months ago, I had a small stroke. Nothing dramatic. No ambulance wailing or bright lights. Just a flicker in my left hand that wouldn't let go of a coffee mug. I sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes watching my fingers twitch like they had forgotten they belonged to me. I didn't tell anyone for 2 days. When I finally did, my son Gregory drove up from Costa Mesa with his wife, Allison, and their teenage daughter. "You're coming back with us, Ma," he said. "We've got space." Space. What he meant was a 2-car garage with 1 working outlet and a water-stained ceiling. He didn't mean the guest room they converted into an office/Peloton room. He didn't mean the den where they had their reading nook and blackout curtains. He meant a storage unit with lawn chairs and a beer fridge. I didn't protest. I was still dizzy from the stroke. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself I was grateful. The first night, I layered 2 sweaters under my robe and tucked my legs under the cot. The wind came in through the cracks beneath the door. I could hear the humming of the HVAC unit inside the house. Warmth just beyond a wall I wasn't invited to cross. I stayed still. That's how you survive the cold. Stillness. I tried to recall the cases I used to file. Restraining orders, power of attorney shifts, quiet divorces where the only thing contested was who got the dog. The rules made sense to me. The courthouse was predictable. But family moved like shadows, gentle one day, cruel the next. The second morning, Gregory knocked on the garage door like I was a tenant he barely knew. He didn't come in, just called out, "You need anything, Ma?" I said no. The truth, I needed a heater. I needed a chair that didn't squeak. I needed my name back. Allison passed me later that day holding a tray of almond biscotti. I could smell the espresso from the hallway. She didn't even glance toward the garage. Just said, "Can you keep the door closed?" The draft messes with the thermostat. I nodded. I felt 76 all at once. But I still had one thing they underestimated. Memory. Memory is not fragile. It is evidence. And while they saw a woman in a robe and slippers, I still remembered how to file a motion. I still remembered the names of every judge I ever worked under. I still remembered how to pull records, submit copies, and trace assets. Most of all, I remembered that silence is not the same as surrender. That evening, I pulled my old tablet from the suitcase I had stored behind the cot. I hadn't turned it on in weeks. The battery was low, but I had enough time to send one message. To a woman named Shirley Grant. Shirley was a retired clerk from Superior Family Court in Santa Ana. We hadn't spoken in years, but I remembered what she told me at my retirement party. "If you ever find yourself living a lie to make someone else comfortable, call me. I won't ask questions. I'll just listen." So I sent one line, "Shirley, I think I'm being disappeared politely. You were right." She replied 3 minutes later, "Lorraine, start taking notes. This isn't over." I sat upright that night, cold but awake, watching the garage door, listening for footsteps, replaying the look on Gregory's face when he saw me unpack my own blankets like it was normal. I counted every sound: the tap of a drip, the whir of a passing car, the laughter inside the house. I wasn't in a home. I was in holding. But I wasn't done yet, not even close. Sometimes the greatest betrayal doesn't come with shouting. It comes with gentle neglect, with comfort weaponized into silence. They didn't scream at me. They just made space where I wouldn't be seen. But a woman like me doesn't vanish quietly. Not when she remembers everything. And not when the law is still her oldest friend. They say the worst part of winter is the wind. I disagree. The worst part is the silence it leaves behind. The garage didn't echo like a real room. It swallowed sound. No birdsong, no hallway shuffle, no clinking dishes. Just my own breath and the faint ticking of a watch I hadn't wound since before the stroke. By the third night, I had learned every groan of the water heater. I knew which floorboard creaked outside the garage door. I knew the rhythm of the central air system in the main house. Warm air that would never reach me. But I also learned something else. Gregory talks when he thinks no one can hear him. It was nearly midnight when I heard it. A low voice near the kitchen. The drywall between the garage and the living room was thin, and in the quiet of night, it carried his words like whispers under a door. She's still sharp. But if she slips even once, we push guardianship. Then Allison. Sharper still. We can't afford to wait. Her account has over 80 grand in it. You want to watch that go to hospice bills. They were not talking about my comfort. They were talking about my money. My future me. I curled tighter into the cot, hands under my knees, staring at the ceiling like it could protect me. But I didn't cry. Not even then. I had cried once already, when Gregory forgot my birthday last year and called 2 days late, saying, "I thought I did call." That was the moment I realized I'd raised a man who could forget the woman who taught him how to read. This was the moment I realized he wanted to forget me entirely. The next morning, I waited until the house emptied. Allison had her morning yoga class. Gregory took Lily to school, and I crept out to the driveway to stretch my legs. My knees barked like old dogs, but I kept my spine straight. Dignity has a posture. I walked to the mailbox and retrieved the usual pile: a coupon book, a property tax statement, and a letter from my pharmacy reminding me to refill my statins. I tucked them under my sweater and shuffled back. The neighbors across the street were putting up Christmas lights. I wondered if they knew the woman across the way was sleeping beside paint cans and yard tools. Back inside, I reached for my phone. I'd hidden it in a shoebox. Battery turned off to avoid questions. I turned it on now, thumb shaking only slightly, and scrolled to a contact I had saved under G, not Gregory. Georgia, my niece. She was my brother's daughter, lived up in San Luis Obispo. A quiet girl with a loud heart. I dialed. "Hello, Georgia, it's Aunt Lorraine." A pause. Then, "Andy, you okay? You sound cold." I laughed softly. "That's because I am." I told her just a bit. Enough to let her know I wasn't in the house. That I was in the garage, temporarily. I didn't say I hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. I didn't say I hadn't seen daylight through glass. I didn't say I had heard my son discuss my cognitive competency like I was a stock portfolio. But Georgia is smart. She heard it anyway. "I'm coming down," she said. "Tomorrow." Don't argue, I didn't. That night, the garage felt even colder. Or maybe I was just more aware of it. I tried to warm my feet by rubbing them together. I thought about my late husband, Charles, how he used to wrap my feet in his flannel robe when we watched old movies on the couch. Charles would have never allowed this. He once drove back 3 hours to bring me the keys I'd forgotten when visiting my sister in San Diego. Now his son left me with the flashlight that flickered every time the heater kicked on. I whispered out loud, "I'm not done yet." That's when I reached for the object I hadn't touched in months. My old audio recorder. A courtroom relic. One of the last things I kept when I retired. It still worked. I clicked it on, pressed record, and whispered, "This is Lorraine Taylor. Date December 7th. Time 11:43 p.m. Location garage 238 Sycamore Street. This is my account. I recorded everything I remembered from the conversations. The exact words I heard through the wall. The cold. The folding cot. The power play disguised as family. The fear dressed as politeness. And I ended it with one line. They put me here to disappear. But I remember every detail. And I'm not done. Sometimes silence is more violent than shouting. It creeps in like frost and settles in your bones, telling you to sit still and stay grateful. But I have lived too long, worked too hard, and lost too much to be grateful for scraps. If remembering is the first act of resistance, then this was mine. Because once you record the truth, it can't be buried. Georgia arrived the next morning. She didn't knock. She opened the garage door herself, squinting as the light cut through the darkness like a courtroom spotlight. For a second, I was ashamed, not of the mess, but of how small I looked. Hunched on the cot, wrapped in 2 thrifted blankets, holding a thermos like a baby bottle. "Auntie," she whispered, eyes brimming. I didn't speak. I only nodded. I didn't want pity. I wanted her to see clearly. She stepped inside. No hesitation. No performance. Then she knelt. That's how I knew this wasn't going to be another polite visit. Georgia wasn't here for a Christmas card check-in. She was here to help me stand up again. She pulled up an old lawn chair, sat beside the cot, and unzipped her coat. "You tell me everything," she said. So I did. I told her about the cold, about Gregory's voice through the wall, about Allison's laughter echoing behind closed doors, about the whispered words I would have once flagged as elder coercion during my courthouse days. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. Then, like a lawyer cross-examining the silence, she asked, "Do you have proof?" I reached beneath my pillow and handed her the recorder. Georgia clicked through the files. Her brow furrowed. Her mouth stayed shut, but her hands, they clenched tighter with each passing minute. Finally, she looked up. "This isn't just wrong. It's abuse." I nodded. She leaned in and whispered, "We're going to fix this." That night, Georgia didn't leave. She rolled out a yoga mat and slept beside me on the concrete floor. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The quiet between us felt nothing like the silence of the past nights. This one wasn't laced with fear. It was filled with fuel. The next morning, Georgia brought in a bag. Inside her laptop, portable scanner, a file folder, and a single yellow legal pad. "You're going to tell me everything again," she said, but this time like a deposition. Dates, times, quotes. "Let's build your case." And so we did. We sat on opposite ends of the garage, me wrapped in every sweater I owned, her typing like fury, stopping only to ask for clarification. When did he mention guardianship? Were there witnesses when Allison said that? Did they bring in any medical staff? I hadn't been this sharp in weeks. For the first time since the stroke, my mind felt like mine again. It was like waking up in a courtroom of memory, and suddenly I was back at my desk, clicking through files, marking names with post-it flags, preparing evidence not for a boss, but for myself. By noon, Georgia looked up from her laptop and said, "Do you still have friends in the system?" "I might." "Then call them." So I did. I called Deborah Vasquez, a retired district clerk who now consulted on elder cases. She once joked that I knew more about guardianship loopholes than most estate lawyers. I told her everything. She didn't gasp. She didn't overreact. She just said, "Do you have documentation?" I said, "I have receipts, audio, and witnesses." Her voice turned steel. "Then let's remind them who you are." By 4:00 p.m., Deborah had connected us to a civil attorney who specialized in elder coercion and power of attorney disputes. By 6:00 p.m., we had uploaded the files to a secure cloud. By 8:00 p.m., I had signed a limited power of legal action, allowing Georgia to act on my behalf. Not because I couldn't fight for myself, but because you don't walk into war alone. That night, back in the garage, I held the recorder in my hands and whispered, "December 4th. The plan is in motion. I am not hidden. I am not helpless. And I am not done." Then I clicked it off and smiled. It's not always a scream that starts the revolution. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, and sometimes with the niece who sees through pleasantries and calls injustice by its name. I was not buried. I was preparing. And soon, they'd remember exactly who taught the law how to stand. 2 days after Georgia arrived, I stopped flinching when the garage door opened. Not because the cold disappeared. Not because anything in the house changed, but because I had changed. Each passing hour wasn't just survival, it was documentation. Every word they spoke near the kitchen wall was transcribed. Every laugh at my expense recorded. Every time they mentioned, "When we take over her finances." Georgia filed it under a new folder, intent to coerce audio evidence. She labeled everything like a court brief. By the morning of December 5th, we had 11 voice recordings, 4 witness names, 3 examples of intentional neglect, and 1 undeniable motive. Financial control. I didn't feel powerless anymore. I felt prepared. Georgia printed out the transcripts and highlighted the key phrases in yellow. I hadn't seen a highlighter used that aggressively since my deposition days. We were sitting on overturned crates when she looked up and asked quietly, "Do you want to go to the courthouse with me today?" I blinked. "You think we're ready?" Georgia didn't answer. She just handed me a folder. Inside, a drafted petition for temporary protection, a signed affidavit from me, a sealed statement from Deborah Vasquez, and at the top, typed neatly in bold, "Petition for emergency order, Taylor v. Taylor." I stared at the word Taylor. My last name, his too. That day it would stop protecting him. We arrived at the Orange County Courthouse at 2:11 p.m. The clerk at the Civil Division looked up, then looked again. "Lorraine." I smiled. "Still walking?" She chuckled. "Barely. What brings you here?" I handed her the envelope. The smile vanished. She read. Her lips pressed tight. She nodded. "We'll expedite this." By 4:35 p.m., I was sitting across from a pro tem judge, a man who once spilled coffee on my shoe in a hallway back in 2003 and apologized for 20 minutes. He remembered me, and he read every page like it mattered. Because it did, he looked up and said, "You're asking for emergency action within 72 hours. "Yes." "And you've submitted the audio?" "Yes." "And do you believe there's imminent harm?" I didn't hesitate. No heat, no access to medication, no keys. Intent to force guardianship. I'd call that harm with a calendar. He nodded slowly. Then he stamped the file. Order granted. When we stepped out into the hallway, Georgia exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. "I didn't realize," she said, "how fast the law can move when it remembers who it's meant to protect." I looked down at the stamped folder in my hands, the red ink still fresh. "It's not fast," I replied. "It's just finally walking in the right direction." That night, Gregory came home early. Allison followed, sunglasses still on. They didn't say a word to the garage. Not that I expected them to. But this time, I didn't listen behind the wall. I sat quietly in my cot, reading the order again. Effective immediately, Gregory Taylor and Allison Taylor are to have no access to the petitioner's finances, medical decisions, or legal records. All attempts at guardianship or power of attorney are to be suspended pending investigation. It was just paper. But in my world, paper was power. And now, I held it again. When they pushed me into a garage, they thought they were removing my comfort. But what they really did was return me to the one place they couldn't control. My mind. Every injustice has a footprint, and I followed mine back to where the law still remembered my name. They took away my room. I took back the system, and the first weapon I chose was paper. The house was quiet the next morning. Too quiet. I knew that quiet, it wasn't peace, it was calculation. They'd felt something shift, but didn't know what yet. Good. Let them wonder. I had spent enough nights wondering if I was still human in their eyes. Now it was their turn to feel the uncertainty of consequence. Georgia was already up, brewing coffee with the portable kettle she'd brought. The smell filled the garage. I hadn't realized how long it had been since something warm reached my nose. "I'm filing the delivery motion today," she said, placing a small stack of documents into her tote. "By 3:00 p.m., they'll be officially served." I looked at the folded coat on the edge of my cot, dark navy wool, the one Charles gave me on our last Christmas together. It still held his scent. It still made me feel tall. "I'm walking with you," I said. Georgia didn't argue. At 2:45 p.m., we returned to the house, but we didn't go through the garage. We walked right through the front door. Gregory was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling on his phone, cereal bowl half full beside him. Allison leaned against the counter, sipping a smoothie, face blank. When they saw me, really saw me, standing straight in my coat, folder in hand, expression unreadable, something flickered in Gregory's face. Fear, memory, guilt trying to reattach itself to a man who'd torn it off. He straightened. Ma, I placed the envelope on the table, slowly, deliberately. He reached for it like it might bite him. Then he opened it. I watched his lips move as he read. Notice of protective petition, filed emergency financial freeze pending investigation, immediate suspension of guardianship applications. His mouth twitched. What is this? I didn't answer. He kept reading. Wet, you're filing legal action. Against your own defendant, I said softly. He froze. Allison looked up from her phone. You're suing us. I turned toward her. No, I'm protecting myself. You just happened to be standing in the way. Gregory slammed the paper on the table. This is ridiculous. Georgia stepped forward, pulling out her phone calmly. Actually, it's filed under Statute 42-4 of California Elder Protection Code. You should know that one, Greg. Your mother used to type it 100 times a week. He turned to her, seething. You're just a niece. You don't even live here. Georgia smiled, cold and precise. And yet I'm the one who helped her remember who she is. There was a pause, one of those long, suffocating ones that fill a room like smoke. Then Gregory muttered, You really think some old documents and stories are going to stop us? I stepped forward, my voice low, even. I don't need stories. I have proof. I have my voice. And I have everything you didn't delete fast enough. His jaw clenched. He looked at me like I'd just come back from the dead. But I hadn't died. I had documented. Georgia handed him a small packet of copied transcripts and recordings. His hands shook slightly, not from cold, from realization. That night I didn't sleep in the garage. I didn't sleep in the guest room either. I sat at the kitchen table, my table, wrapped in my coat, drinking real coffee from a real mug, watching the light flicker through the blinds. Gregory didn't come back downstairs. Neither did Allison, but the paper was on the table, and the law was watching now. There is something sacred about returning to the space where you were once erased. Not with vengeance, not with rage, but with proof. They thought the garage would break me. But all it did was sharpen the truth I already knew. You don't need to raise your voice when you know how to raise the law. By noon the next day, the neighborhood was buzzing, and not with Christmas cheer. A marked sedan had parked in front of the house. Not police, not child services. The Office of Adult Protective Services. 2 agents stepped out, one in a gray suit, the other with a clipboard. Both with the demeanor of people who've seen what happens when power is abused behind closed doors. I didn't speak when they entered. I didn't have to. The law had found its voice again, and this time it wasn't just mine. Gregory opened the door with his fake pleasant face. Can I help you? The man in the gray suit held up a folder. We're here regarding a complaint filed on behalf of Ms. Lorraine Taylor. We're initiating a wellness and abuse investigation as ordered by the court. Gregory chuckled. Nervous, shallow. This is all a big misunderstanding, he said. She's fine. I mean, she's here, right? The woman beside him looked over his shoulder and saw me standing at the end of the hallway. She stepped forward and asked, Ems, Taylor, are you able to speak freely? I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just said, yes. Follow me, and I led them straight to the garage. I didn't speak with outrage. I spoke like I did when I presented evidence to a judge. Steady, exact, measured. Here were the recordings. Here were the photos Georgia took of the cot, the sawdust, the thermostat readings. Here was the unused medication bottle with a faded label and my name spelled correctly. Here was the blanket I bled into from the coughing fits. Here was the voicemail from Gregory 2 weeks ago, saying, Ma, you'll be more comfortable in the garage. It's quieter. Here was proof of calculated exile. The clipboard agent nodded slowly as she documented everything. Then she asked one question. Did they ever threaten you directly? I paused. No, I said. They didn't have to. They made the cold do the talking. When the agents left, they didn't say much. They didn't have to. The look they gave Gregory on their way out was enough. It was the look we used to give repeat defendants. The ones who smirked too easily. The ones who thought the rules didn't apply at home. It was a look that meant we'll be back. And next time, it won't just be a clipboard. That night, Gregory knocked on the garage door. I didn't answer. Then he knocked again, harder. Ma, we need to talk. I opened the door just an inch and said, no, son. We needed to talk 3 weeks ago. Now you can talk to my lawyer. I closed it gently. The kind of gentle that says, you are not invited here anymore. Georgia returned later that night from filing additional motions at the courthouse. Tomorrow, the press will know, she said quietly. The story, she nodded. Just enough to warn people, not enough to humiliate him. I looked down at my old courtroom watch. The one I wore on every verdict day. I pressed the crown once. The tick was still strong, so be it, I said. The garage was still cold that night. But I wasn't. I was wrapped in something stronger than wool, agency. You can live with cold air, but you can't live with the coldness of someone you raised turning silence into a weapon. They wanted me quiet. They got me organized. They wanted me compliant. They got me prepared. And now, the law wasn't just on my side. It was knocking at their door. The article dropped 2 days later. Not in a national paper. Not yet. Just the Orange County Sentinel, a modest publication read mostly by retirees, city workers, and courthouse veterans who still trusted real ink over algorithms. But that was all I needed. The headline was clean, undramatic, but sharp. Retired clerk files protective order against son, Ilder Korshin alleged. Under it, a subhead. Evidence includes recordings, documents, and years of silence. I read it at 5:42 a.m., wrapped in my coat, seated in the corner of the garage where the signal was strongest. Georgia had left early to meet with our attorney. The house was still, quiet, but outside the story had already begun to move. By noon, 2 things happened. My old supervisor called. Is it true? She asked. Was it Gregory? I didn't answer with words. I just let out a long breath. She replied, Lorraine, you have people. Just say the word. The church Gregory and Allison attended issued a statement. A quiet one, no names. Just a line slipped into the weekly bulletin. We are reviewing leadership roles in light of recent reports. We take elder care seriously. That told me everything I needed to know. They were backing away. By the time Gregory came home that night, he was pacing. Not storming, not shouting, pacing. He knew the war had started, and for once, he didn't know the rules. I watched him from the crack in the garage door. He didn't even look at the garage. He looked at his phone, then the window, then the mailbox, looking for control. But control had changed addresses. Later, as Georgia and I reviewed the formal response from the court, she turned to me and said, You're winning. I shook my head. I'm surviving out loud. That's different. That night, I received a letter, a real one. It was from a woman named Estelle. She lived 4 blocks away. She had read the article. In it, she wrote, I've been sleeping on my son's pull-out couch for 2 years. I clean. I babysit. But I'm not allowed to touch the thermostat. When I asked to move to the den last month, his wife said, The den is for guests, not leftovers. I cried that night. Then I read your story. Thank you for reminding me I am not disposable. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside my cot. It was the first warmth I felt all day. The next morning, I went outside and stood in the driveway. I didn't walk far. I just stood, back straight, eyes forward. Neighbors passed. One woman waved. Another slowed her car, rolled down the window, and said, That was you, wasn't it? I smiled gently. Yes, she nodded, almost reverently. You gave us all permission. Back inside, I sat down at the kitchen table, the real one, the one I'd been exiled from. Gregory stood by the sink, clearly unsure whether to speak. Mom, he began. I looked up slowly. He stopped. That was enough. He had lost the right to casual conversation. I didn't need revenge. I needed room, and I had finally taken mine back. There is a difference between asking for help and being treated like furniture. They said I was family until it was inconvenient. But now my name is inked in headlines, etched into court orders, and whispered between women who once stayed silent like I did. This isn't the end of my story. It's just the moment I became visible again. It was quiet again. The kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, it warns. The story had spread. Whispers became articles. Articles became emails. And still, Gregory hadn't said a word to me since the protective order went public. But the silence wasn't surrender. It was stalling. I knew that silence well. From courtrooms, from mediation rooms, from deposition tables. It's the sound a liar makes when he's trying to find a new angle. Georgia had returned home briefly. Her firm needed her back in Los Angeles for a case. She promised to return by the end of the week. Before she left, she tightened her grip on my hand and said, "Don't let the silence fool you. If he starts being nice, he's planning something." I believed her. I just didn't expect someone else to make the next move. It was Tuesday morning when the knock came. Not on the garage. On the front door. I was at the kitchen table. Yes, my table now, slicing an apple when I heard it. The knock was soft, too soft for someone delivering packages or justice. Gregory was upstairs. Allison was out. Probably sulking at Pilots. I opened the door and froze. She stood no taller than my shoulder. Slender. Early 30s, maybe. Brown hair pulled into a precise ponytail. A worn coat, too thin for December, and eyes I recognized but couldn't place. "Lorraine Taylor," she asked. I nodded. Then she did the strangest thing. She stepped back and held up a folder. "My name is Claire Harris. I'm your former daughter-in-law." I stared at her, not because I didn't believe her, but because Gregory never told me he'd been married before Allison. She saw the confusion on my face and offered a bitter smile. "You weren't supposed to know. Neither was your granddaughter." "What?" She reached into the folder and pulled out a photo. A girl 10, maybe 11, standing beside a piano, smiling. Gap-toothed and radiant. Her cheeks, her eyes. She looked exactly like Gregory at that age. "I didn't come for money," Claire said quickly. "I came because I saw your name in the paper. And I need to tell you the truth before something worse happens." She looked around, then leaned closer. "Gregory is trying to file for full custody of Lily, but not the one who lives here. He's after mine." It hit me like a dropped gavel. Another child, a hidden child. And now, another woman caught in Gregory's web. Claire stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I never told you because I signed a non-disclosure agreement after the divorce. He paid me off. Said he didn't want his new wife to know he had a daughter out of wedlock. I took the money and ran. I thought it was over." She set the folder down in front of me. Inside court filings, Gregory's signature, paternity documents. Real. All of it. And then the final twist. "I think he's trying to move your estate into a trust. One he can use to show financial stability for the custody hearing. If he gets guardianship over you, he can present himself as responsible, as a man who takes care of his aging mother." She paused. Swallowed. "He's using you, Lorraine, as evidence." I closed the folder slowly. I didn't cry. Not anymore. I just looked at her and said, "Then let's reopen the case. A family's secrets don't stay buried. They wait, quietly, until the moment they're most dangerous." I thought this story was about me sleeping in a garage. But it turns out, I wasn't the only woman my son tried to make invisible. Now, with truth at the table and another mother beside me, this fight just became a war worth finishing. The house smelled like cinnamon. I had a pot of tea steeping when Claire sat down across from me at the kitchen table. Yes, the same one I was once denied a seat at. She hadn't removed her coat. I could tell by the way her fingers trembled that it wasn't the weather she was afraid of. It was being believed. Claire placed a USB drive on the table. Then she said the words no mother ever expects to hear about her own child. Your son used to leave me out in the car when he'd visit you. I blinked. She nodded. He'd come in, say he was alone. Said you didn't like loud people. I was pregnant once when he did that. I tried to remember. When was Gregory ever alone? When did he say no one was in the car? Too many times. Too many chances I had to ask questions, and didn't. Claire pulled out another document. Custody filings. Gregory had submitted paperwork to family court in Santa Clara to gain shared custody of Maya, her daughter, under the name Lily Maya Taylor, a combination meant to confuse the records. He claimed he was financially responsible and providing elder care for his mother full-time. He had even submitted a photo of me asleep in the garage cot as proof. Proof that he was caring for me, my fingers curled around the tea mug, not to drink, to keep from shaking. Claire continued. He's already reached out to a judge. The hearing is next week. He thinks you'll be too occupied with your own petition to get involved. He thinks I'll be too broke to fight back. She smiled then, not kindly. He forgot what happens when two women have nothing left to lose. I looked down at the USB. What's on it? Recordings. Mine, from back then, him screaming. Telling me to get out of sight. Threatening to say I was unstable. Her jaw tightened. You're not the only one who started pressing record. Lorraine. I rose from the table, crossed the room, and opened the drawer where I kept the legal folders Georgia had prepped. I pulled one out and set it between us. Then I slid a pen across the table. We're filing a motion for joint response. Claire blinked. What does that mean? It means you're not alone. Not this time. And neither am I. For the first time in days, she took off her coat. That afternoon, we went together to the county court liaison office. Georgia, still in LA, connected us via video with a senior paralegal who specialized in multi-party abuse claims. Her name was Eileen May, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who used to run petitions for housing disputes and domestic restraining orders. She didn't flinch when we explained the situation. She just said, I've seen this before. Men like him build families like they build credit, acquire use, discard. But this time he's overdrawn. We filed an emergency joinder request tying my elder abuse petition to Claire's custody defense. A motion to disclose financial misrepresentation, including the submitted photo, and a protective review request for both Maya and myself. By 5:00 p.m. the filings were live. By 6:15 p.m., Gregory received the alerts in his email, and at 6:22 p.m., he stormed into the kitchen. What the hell is going on? He snapped, waving his phone. You're involving her. Claire didn't blink. I did. I stood. And said, you used my body to build your image. Now watch how we use your lies to build a case. Gregory slammed the chair back and stormed out. But the only sound I cared about was the quiet clink of two women clicking open a laptop and working together. That night, I sat beside Claire in the garage. Not because I had to, but because we were planning something bigger than revenge. We were building a blueprint for justice, and his house would be the foundation we take back brick by brick. Justice rarely arrives as a single strike. It comes in layers, one woman's truth folding into another's pain until the weight is too much to ignore. He built his power on our silence. But now, two voices, once cast aside, have found each other. And no man with our names in his paperwork will walk away untouched. It started with a click. Not the click of a gavel or a lock or even a mouse. It was the click of a forgotten drawer, rusted at the edge, stuck from years of paint. It was in Gregory's old bedroom. Claire and I had gone in to look for old photographs. Something to prove Maya's parentage. Something that showed he had once acknowledged her. Something physical. What we found was far more dangerous. Tucked beneath the stack of old tax folders and bank brochures was a file marked only with a single initial, L. Inside, we found a scanned copy of my signature, forged, on a power of attorney document I never signed. 3 printed emails between Gregory and a real estate agent, listing the house for future private sale, with his name as the sole inheritor, and worst of all, a draft email to a memory care facility in San Diego requesting a private consultation on placing an elderly parent under observation, dated 2 weeks before I ever moved into the garage. I stared at the documents, and for the first time in this entire process, I felt afraid. Because this wasn't about property anymore. This was a pre-planned erasure. Claire stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. When I turned to her, I saw it in her eyes too. Gregory hadn't just been cruel. He had been intentional. She whispered, "He was going to institutionalize you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not yet. That night Georgia returned. She walked through the front door, dropped her bags, and hugged me longer than usual. Then she looked around. Her eyes narrowed. Something's changed. We handed her the file. She read it in silence, then said, "We're adding attempted medical coercion to the charge list, and we're opening a fraud case." Over the next 48 hours, the case file tripled in size. Georgia moved into high gear. She contacted a geriatric psychiatrist to review the forged documents, a handwriting expert to confirm the forgery, and a retired investigator who used to work for the court's elder protection unit. His name was Nathan Keller, a quiet, silver-haired man with a limp and a notebook he never let go of. He came to the house that Friday. He walked through the garage, sat on the cot, sniffed the air, then said, "Seen worse, but never from someone this educated. That's what makes it dangerous." He sat down with me at the table and asked a single question. "Do you want to win, Lorraine, or do you want him exposed?" I blinked. "Aren't those the same?" Nathan shook his head. "One gives you peace. The other gives every woman like you a path." I chose the path. And so the strategy shifted. We weren't just building a case. We were building a precedent. We submitted a formal request to open a parallel fraud investigation into Gregory's forged documents, a temporary freeze on the family trust account, which Gregory had been quietly moving money from, and a subpoena for the real estate firm to turn over all communication threads. By Sunday, the response came back. Gregory had tried to list my house as pre-inherited property, despite legal documentation showing joint ownership between me and Charles. He even signed my name to a preliminary agreement of sale. The sale had not gone through, but the intent was clear. That evening, I walked into the living room where Gregory sat, pale, staring at his phone. He didn't look up. I handed him a single page. He took it. "Read it," froze. At the top, petition to add charges: fraud, forgery, attempted institutionalization. He swallowed, finally looked at me. "You're really going to destroy me?" I stood quietly for a moment, then replied, "No, you did that. I'm just letting the light in." He didn't speak again, but when he left the room, he didn't walk. He shrank, and I stood a little taller, because for every forged signature he thought I'd never find, I had 2 witnesses and a working pen. They say evil hides in shadows, but sometimes it hides in spreadsheets and polite smiles. My son didn't just forget who I was. He tried to erase me on paper before I could resist. But I didn't raise my voice. I raised proof. And now, for every woman left in a garage with no explanation, I'm leaving a trail that leads straight to the door of justice. When the invitation came, I almost deleted it. It was an email from the National Alliance for Elder Justice, asking if I would be willing to speak at their annual summit in Washington, D.C., not as a victim, as a witness. I stared at the screen for nearly 10 minutes, the cursor blinking like it was daring me to respond. I hadn't been on a stage since my retirement speech 9 years ago. And back then, I had spoken in front of judges I knew, clerks I respected, and attorneys I'd trained. Now, this would be an audience of strangers, lawmakers, advocates, reporters, survivors, and more than anything, daughters and mothers who might be one wrong signature away from a garage of their own. Georgia was the one who convinced me. "Mom," she said, "your voice isn't just a story. It's a precedent with a pulse." So I agreed. 2 weeks later, I stood backstage in a hotel ballroom just 5 blocks from the Capitol. Claire was in the front row. So was Maya, her daughter, Georgia waited in the wings holding my coat. The moderator cleared her throat at the podium and said, "And now, a woman who needs no title, only truth, Ms. Lorraine Taylor." I walked to the stage slowly, but with purpose. No shaking, no notes, no teleprompter. Just a microphone and memory. And I began, "I am Lorraine Taylor. I was a court clerk for 47 years. I filed restraining orders, processed evictions, witnessed testimonies. But I never expected that one day I would become a case file of my own. My son put me in a garage and called it care. He used my silence as a strategy. He planned my erasure with legal precision. But I knew the law, I was the law, and I still remembered how to use it. The room was silent. Then one woman near the back whispered, "Yes," and then another. And then they stood, not for applause, for identification. They had seen it, lived it, escaped it. And now, they heard it, out loud. When I finished, I stepped off stage, back into the arms of the women who once called themselves weak. But not anymore. The video of my speech went viral the next day. Over 3 million views in 48 hours. Hashtags like Fay Garage Justice and Fay Not Silent Anymore trended on social media. Dozens of elder advocacy groups across the country shared the video. But the real surprise came in an email from a reporter at the San Jose Times. The subject line read, "Or G. Gregory Taylor's previous employer whistleblower info, can we talk?" I opened the message. Inside was a scanned letter, anonymous, but clearly internal. Gregory Taylor manipulated internal estate funds while working as an associate at Halbrook and Wade Investments. 2 elderly clients lost access to their accounts shortly after he assumed their portfolios. Both later filed complaints, but the firm quietly settled and dismissed him with NDA. He hadn't just done this to me, he'd done it before. He was a serial predator, quiet, polished, practiced. And now we had a trail. I forwarded the email to Nathan Keller, our retired investigator. He called me within the hour, "Lorraine." He said, "I think we're just scratching the surface." Later that evening, I stood on my porch, not the garage, the front porch. The air was crisp. The neighborhood was quiet. But I wasn't alone anymore. Inside, Claire and Maya were baking cookies. Georgia was finishing filings for a formal multi-state complaint. And somewhere out there, a reporter had begun peeling back the mask my son had worn for decades. The next time Gregory would see my name, it wouldn't be in a text. It would be in a headline he couldn't control. I used to think justice was slow, procedural, cold. But sometimes, it starts with a woman speaking on a stage she never expected to stand on. My story wasn't just mine. It was ours, shared by every woman forced to survive in silence. And now, that silence has become a storm. One my son can't hide from anymore. The invitation arrived by registered mail, hand-delivered by a man in a gray blazer who waited on my porch like he wasn't sure whether to knock or salute. The envelope was thick, embossed, and heavy inside. A formal letter bearing the seal of the Office of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. They weren't asking for another speech. They were offering a position. Senior Policy Advisor on Elder Protective Reform, a 1-year appointment, Washington, D.C. full access to legislative sessions, drafting authority, and direct influence over elder care legislation at the federal level. I sat at the kitchen table, reading the letter in silence. Claire was on the couch playing cards with Maya. Georgia leaned against the counter, eyes fixed on me. "You don't have to decide now," she said. But I already knew what she was thinking, and I already knew what I was feeling. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was a crossroads. Since the garage, my days had been filled with motion. Filings, strategy sessions, calls from reporters, interviews with survivors, letters from strangers. But this wasn't about fighting the system anymore. This was an offer to enter it, to help design it. I thought about the women who had written to me, Estelle, still waiting for her son to move out of her house. A woman from Oregon who lived in her RV after her daughter claimed the deed to the home. A former nurse in New Mexico who was threatened with being declared mentally incompetent if she reported abuse at her assisted living facility. They didn't need speeches. They needed laws. They needed someone inside. But there was a cost. If I accepted, I'd have to leave California, step away from the legal firestorm still surrounding Gregory, distance myself from the civil cases. Claire's custody battle, the fraud investigation, the housing reversal motion still pending. I would have to become something I never expected to be. Not a survivor, not a witness, but a policy architect. That night, I sat on the porch beside Nathan Keller. He lit a cigar, though he didn't smoke it. Just let it burn beside him like a small signal flare for memory. "You're quiet," he said. I nodded. He took a long breath and said, "Let me ask you one question, Lorraine. Do you want to finish punishing your son? Or do you want to make sure no one like him ever gets to do this again?" I didn't answer, but I heard the answer echo in my bones. The next morning I called the office in D.C. I spoke clearly. I accepted. That afternoon, I walked into the house with the decision written all over my face. Claire smiled, proud. Georgia swallowed hard, nodded. But Maya, she looked confused. "You're leaving?" she asked. I bent down, met her eyes. "I'm going to try and fix the world that let your daddy get away with what he did, so that by the time you grow up, no one ever has to sleep in a garage again." She didn't say anything. She just hugged me so tight I thought I'd break. But I didn't, because this time I wasn't leaving broken. I was leaving with blueprints. As the sun set, I placed a final envelope on the table. Inside, a signed affidavit, an open letter to the courts, and a notarized document officially transferring full legal guardianship of Claire's daughter back to her, without opposition, with my signature attached in witness. Gregory would no longer have any legal path forward, and he would never speak for me or for Maya again. I packed that night with deliberate calm. My navy coat, my tablet, my recorder, my watch, and the last printed letter from a woman in Iowa who wrote, "I watched your speech in a shelter. I haven't seen my name on a mailbox in 4 years. But after hearing you, I went outside and wrote it on the wall with chalk, just to remember it's still mine." Justice isn't always found in the courtroom. Sometimes it waits in legislation, in policy, in the pen that rewrites the rules. I didn't want to leave my home. But if going means thousands of women can finally stay in theirs, then let this be the last move I ever have to make for survival. From now on, I moved for change. Washington, D.C. was colder than I remembered. I had only visited twice before, once for a conference in '97, and again in 2011 to tour the Capitol with Charles after he retired. This time I wasn't visiting. This time I was here to work. My office was small, windowless, tucked on the 6th floor of a steel building 4 blocks from the National Mall. A plaque read, "Office of Elder Policy Reform, Advisor Lorraine Taylor." It felt surreal, like someone had taken my garage cot and swapped it for a government desk. But the part that startled me most wasn't the job. It was the silence. No calls about Gregory, no knocks on the door, no whispers through drywall. Just clean carpets, filtered air, professional greetings and acronyms I had to look up twice. I was 3 weeks into the role when I moved into a modest second-floor apartment on the edge of DuPont Circle. The building was old, pre-war charm, cracked plaster. It reminded me of something, not of California, of before. Before Gregory, before the cold. On my 3rd night I heard it, a thump, then a cry, a child. 2 floors up. Or down, I couldn't tell. I froze, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was too familiar. The next morning, I asked the doorman casually, "Who lives in 3B? He glanced up, hesitated. "A woman and her kid. Just moved in. Husband's not around anymore." Then he leaned closer. "Police came once, but she begged them not to file anything." I thanked him and walked away, my stomach tight. Because I knew that pattern. Not just in paperwork, in tone. The language of, "I'm fine," spoken through bruised lips and cautious eyes. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching frost form on the edge of the glass. It looked like lace, or like cracks in safety glass. By week 4, I had settled into the rhythm of federal work. Meetings, policy reviews, collaboration with advocacy groups, task force proposals. But part of me wasn't here. Part of me was still listening for the next sound through the ceiling. And then it came again. This time louder. A crash. A scream. Then silence. I called security. Then I called Georgia. And then I climbed the stairs myself. Apartment 3B's door was slightly ajar. Inside, the lights were off. I heard the child crying, muffled behind a closed door. And in the hallway, standing barefoot, one hand clutching her arm, was the mother. She looked up when she saw me. She didn't scream. She didn't ask who I was. She just whispered, "Are you the lady from the video?" "The one with the garage." I nodded slowly. She started crying. Not loud. The kind of crying you do when you know someone finally sees you. I helped her sit. She said her name was Selena. Her son was 6. She had left her husband 3 months ago, but didn't qualify for immediate housing assistance. The agency placed her here temporarily. No locks, no cameras, no real help. She'd watched my speech in a women's shelter on an old laptop 2 weeks ago. She remembered my name. "I didn't think people like you would live in buildings like this," she said. I smiled softly. "People like me always end up in buildings like this, until we make sure no one else has to." The next morning, I met with the HS director and submitted my first emergency proposal. An amendment to the Elder and Vulnerable Families Act that would extend protective review access to single parent emergency housing within 14 days of placement. No more blind spots. No more temporary solutions that put women and children in danger. Selena's case became the first flagged under the new draft, and I made her a promise. "You will not become another silent file. Not while I'm here." Later that night, I sat back at my desk, rereading the original letter from the day I arrived. There was a line in it I hadn't noticed before. "We believe your story marks the beginning of a national shift. But stories don't change policy. People do." And this time, I wasn't fighting for a chair at the table. I was building the table itself. The scars we carry aren't always meant to be hidden. Sometimes they light the way forward, for others still in the dark. I didn't expect to find another story inside these walls. But I should have known. Where there is silence, there is always someone waiting to be heard. And now, I have the power to listen and to act. You don't change the law without making enemies. I knew that. I just didn't expect the blow to come from inside the building. It was Monday morning when I stepped into the federal task force meeting. Coffee in hand, notes prepared. Selena's proposal was first on the agenda, but the room felt tense. No one met my eye. One of the interns glanced at the floor when I said good morning. The policy chief, Gwen Blackwell, cleared her throat and gestured toward the projection screen. "We need to discuss something before we move forward," she said quietly. She clicked the remote. A news site popped onto the screen. A bold headline read, "Policy Advisor's Alley Tied to 1980s Foster Abuse Case. Reform Team in Question." Below it, a photograph. A black and white image of Gwen, decades younger, standing in a hallway with a clipboard. I turned to her. She was pale. The room was dead silent. Then Gwen spoke. "I was 23, a junior admin at a foster facility. I didn't know what was happening. I filed a complaint. They buried it." Her voice cracked. "They said if I pushed it, I'd lose my job and never work in government again." She looked at me then. I didn't push. I didn't fight. I stayed quiet. And now they're using that silence, 40 years later, to dismantle everything we've built. I stood slowly, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I closed the binder in front of me. Then I looked at every single person in that room, and I said, "Let me be clear. This system has never been afraid of criminals. It's afraid of women who remember." Gwen didn't fail the system. The system failed her. And now, 40 years later, she's still paying the bill. No one spoke. Not until the director finally said, "We'll postpone the vote on the reform package." Postpone, not cancel. But it felt like ice. That night, Gwen came to my apartment. She didn't want to talk. She just sat on the couch, quiet, looking at her hands. Selena came out of the kitchen with tea. She had been listening, not intruding, witnessing. I heard about the article, she said gently. They're trying to scare you. Gwen gave a weak smile. It's working. Then Selena leaned forward and said something I'll never forget. You may have stayed silent then, but I didn't die because of that. I lived because now you're not silent anymore. The next morning, I called a press contact I'd been ignoring for weeks. A woman named Terry Tran, editor at the Hill Post. Do you want the full story? I asked. She paused. You mean about you? No, I said. About Gwen. Oh, by Friday, the article dropped. They tried to shame her into silence. She built a federal policy instead. It included a full interview with Gwen, official confirmation of her original complaint filing in 1981, signed testimony from 2 former employees who corroborated her story, and a quote from me. Justice delayed is not justice denied if you're still alive to write the next law. Within 24 hours, the vote to postpone was reversed. Selena's amendment was approved unanimously, and Gwen, she got a standing ovation at the next internal briefing. Not for surviving, for staying. But the warning had landed. If we were going to keep fighting at this level, we couldn't just play defense. We had to build faster than they could erase. That evening, I opened my inbox and found over 300 emails. The one that made me pause came from a law student in Minnesota. She wrote, My mother was institutionalized for being forgetful. It took me 6 years to realize it wasn't memory loss. It was grief. She watched your video. She talks again now, she said to tell you. Thank you for remembering what they tried to make her forget. Sometimes the system doesn't crack from violence. It fractures from truth spoken too clearly. They thought we'd scatter when the past came knocking, but we opened the door, not because we had to, but because the only way to protect others is to walk back into the fire, holding the match that almost destroyed us, and light the way. It was raining when he showed up, not a dramatic thunderstorm, just a soft, persistent drizzle that tapped on the windows like an old memory asking to come in. Gwen and I had just finished a late working session. She was filing case summaries. I was reviewing housing codes for amendments. We were tired, but it was a good kind of tired, earned, not drained. Then the intercom buzzed. There's a young man here, says his name is Aiden. Says he used to be in the file, 317B. Gwen dropped her pen. File 317B. I hadn't heard that number since the summit. It was part of a sealed archive Gwen had referenced once. Barely. She called it the one that kept her up at night. A foster system placement. Filed, lost, forgotten. We let him in. He was 20, maybe 21. Lean. Eyes like raw winter. He stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, holding nothing but a thin manila envelope. I didn't know who else to come to, he said. But I saw your face on the news, ma'am, and I remember your voice. He was talking to Gwen. And Gwen, she went pale. His name was Aiden Benton. He had aged out of the foster system 2 years ago. But for a brief 6 months in 2006, when he was just 2 years old, he had been housed at Springvale Children's Residential Unit, the same facility where Gwen had worked in the 1980s. The connection made no sense. Until he opened the envelope. Inside a photo of a baby, a letter dated 1994, a printed copy of a transfer request between facilities, signed but never processed. The baby had been placed under temporary protection, with a note written in the margin, mother unfit. Name withheld. Connected to whistleblower case. Held ENTLCLANCU. Wen read the document. Her knees buckled. I caught her before she fell. She stared at the paper like it was a ghost. And then she whispered, That's my son. We sat in silence. Aiden didn't understand, yet. He had spent his life believing he'd been abandoned. He never knew he was the collateral damage of retaliation. Gwen, at 23, had filed a report about abuse, and in the aftermath, they hadn't just silenced her. They had taken her child. She'd been told he was placed in a safe home, that the adoption went through, that she couldn't know anything more. Her file had been sealed for her protection, but the transfer, it never happened. He'd bounced through 12 placements, graduated from high school in a group home. Found her by accident, through a news clip shared by another former foster youth. I watched Gwen sit across from him, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but Aiden shook his head. "You didn't leave me," he said. "You just got erased?" That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the rain wash away what little doubt I had left about what we were doing. This wasn't just about garages, or cold floors, or legal papers. It was about people who had been systemically deleted, quietly, efficiently, cruelly. The next morning, I walked into our office, and I made a decision. We weren't just going to rewrite policy. We were going to open the vault. I called the director. "I want full review access to every sealed placement file tied to whistleblower reports pre-2000. There was silence on the line. "Then, that's over 9,000 cases." "Lorraine, I know," I said. "Let's start with 317B. Aiden stayed in D.C. that week. He didn't say much. He and Gwen took long walks. Sometimes they sat in silence. But it wasn't heavy. It was the sound of two stories reconnecting across decades of bureaucratic betrayal. On Friday, the AH's office released a public statement. "We are launching a full-scale investigation into all historical foster care placement files suppressed under confidentiality clauses tied to internal whistleblower protection. The review will be led by Lorraine Taylor and her advisory team." We called the project the Quiet Archive. It would be the final piece of the law I wished had existed when I was left in the garage. Because before they silence you with cold, they bury you in paper. Now, we were unburying everything. They didn't just put me in a garage. They buried Gwen's son. They erased the inconvenient. They called it protection. But justice doesn't hide in folders. It lives in the people we failed to count. And now, we're counting every single one of them. The call came late. Georgia answered first. She was screening all media contacts by then. I only heard the tail end of the conversation as she covered the receiver and whispered, "It's a national producer. Primetime. They want Aiden." I looked up from my paperwork. Gwen was already frozen in place. Aiden stood at the doorway, arms crossed. "They said it's a legacy piece," Georgia added. "They want to tell the story of the lost son and the mother who fought back." I expected him to say no, but Aiden surprised me. "I want to do it," he said, quietly but firmly. Gwen looked down. "You don't have to," she said. "You've already done more than enough just by showing up." But he stepped forward, voice steady. "No. I want people to know I existed. I want them to know what it felt like to be forgotten on purpose." Later, he and I sat on a bench outside the office. The sky was gray. Damp DC. In late fall always felt like a closing file drawer. "I need to ask you something," I said. Aiden looked at me, curious. "Do you want justice? Or do you want visibility?" He blinked. "Aren't they the same?" I shook my head. "Justice fixes. Visibility burns. Sometimes you can't have both. Sometimes the light isn't healing. Sometimes it just makes your pain part of someone else's entertainment." He was quiet for a while. Then he said something that cut deep. "You got to tell your story, Lorraine. And it saved people. But what about the ones like me, who didn't get to choose whether we became stories or not?" He wasn't accusing. He was grieving. And I understood that grief. Because I, too, had once been spoken about instead of spoken to. The next day, the production team sent over a pre-interview packet. It was long, too long. They wanted specifics, court dates, photos, emotional reactions, Gwen's hospital records, Aiden's foster history. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a redemption arc with ratings. I watched Gwen read through the request list, and I watched her slowly tear the packet in half. "No," she said simply. "Not like this. We fought to be seen, not to be consumed." Aidan didn't say much that night, but I saw him print something, a letter. He left it on my desk before disappearing into the night. I didn't open it until morning. It said, "Lorraine, you gave me my story back. Now I get to decide how it's told. I may never speak into a microphone, but I will speak with every choice I make from here forward." Thank you for teaching me that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just lives quietly and refuses to die. Aidan, we never did the interview, but the quiet archive expanded that week. Dozens of new submissions came in. One from a man who hadn't seen his sister since 1992. One from a woman who changed her name after her mother forged documents to have her institutionalized. Each file became a quiet monument to the voices they never expected to rise again. And somewhere out there, Aidan was walking in peace, not because the world apologized, but because he no longer carried the silence alone. There's a difference between telling your story and being turned into one. Justice doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes in the form of a young man quietly walking away from a microphone and choosing to carry his name instead of his scars. And in that decision, we found something even stronger than truth. We found ownership. It arrived in a plain brown envelope. No return address. No postmark. Just one word on the front, written in clean, slanted script, Aidan. Georgia found it first in the mailbox reserved for quiet archive submissions. She brought it into my office, frowning. He didn't leave any forwarding address, she said. But you might want to open this. Inside was a letter, folded once, yellowed, smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. Dear Aidan, you don't know me, but I knew your father. His name was Charles Benton. We served together during the late 80s in internal review. Placement systems. Mostly foster monitoring. He wasn't just an officer. He was a whistleblower. The good kind. The kind who stayed quiet long enough to get the evidence, then roared when it mattered. In 1993, he gathered enough documentation to expose something big, a pattern. Children of female whistleblowers in the system were being quietly removed under mental fitness evaluations, often based on fabricated evidence. Their kids were reclassified, moved, sealed. He called it the second erasure. I stopped reading. I looked over at Gwen, whose hands were clenched white on the table. He didn't tell your mother the full truth. Not because he didn't trust her, but because she had already been targeted. He thought he could protect both you by vanishing into the noise. In 1994, just before he planned to go public, he died in what they called a traffic accident. But I was the one who found the brake lines. They weren't worn out. They were cut. Yuen gasped. Georgia covered her mouth. I kept reading. I've held this guilt for 30 years. And now I see your name in the news. I see what you and your mother are doing. Maybe that means it's time for the rest of us to speak. I'm old now. My hands shake. But I still have the files. If you want them, come to 146 Marlowe Street, Pennsylvania. There's no key, just knock. R.D. The room was dead silent. Then Gwen whispered. Charles was the reason I kept going. I thought I'd just lost him to circumstance. Not sabotage. I leaned back in my chair, heart thudding. This wasn't just about Aidan anymore. It wasn't even just about Gwen. It was about a coordinated history of erasure. A pattern, and now we had a trail. That evening I called in my entire team, legal advisors, investigators, archive interns. Even Selena came, holding her sleeping son on her shoulder. I put the letter on the table and said, we'll go to Marlowe Street. We bring cameras. We bring backup. And we don't leave with questions. For the first time in months, I felt something colder than rage. Purpose. Not just to fix what had happened, but to reveal what had always been hidden. Because Aidan's story might be one of hundreds. And if that was true, then this wasn't just a story anymore. It was an investigation. For every injustice that screams, there are 1,000 that whisper. 1,000 stories filed under misunderstanding. 1,000 children like Aidan, stolen not by accident but by design. The truth doesn't always knock. Sometimes, it just waits behind a door we've been too scared to open. And now, we're gonna knock, together. The house at 146 Marlowe Street was older than I expected. 2 stories. Wooden frame, no doorbell, paint flaking like dried memories, no car in the driveway, no curtains in the windows, no sound inside. We knocked, once, then twice. Then, the door opened. A man in his 80s, sharp eyes behind wireframe glasses, opened just wide enough to see who we were. He didn't smile. Didn't ask our names, just said, "You brought too many." I stepped forward. "Mr. R.D.?" He gave a curt nod. "Come in. But only 3 of you. The rest stay outside. If you have phones, they go in this box. I'm not getting killed at 83 because someone can't stay off TikTok." We followed him into a dusty study. Books stacked to the ceiling. Papers in binders labeled by year. 1984 dismissed. 1992 reassigned. 1998 terminated. No inquiry. And then a locked filing cabinet. He bent down, opened it with a brass key around his neck, and pulled out a thick accordion folder marked Asuri Category B. Depi Pestesis. Inside were copies of 2 to 43 children's files flagged under Protective Displacement Unconfirmed, Risk Reclassification Mother Unstable, Intervention Unwarranted File Closed, and in the margins, Mother linked to case against supervisor. Whistleblowing suspected, reassess custodial status. Transfer approved for PR reasons, not safety. Gwen's hands shook. Aiden stepped back, pale. Even I've, hardened by years of documents, felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't incompetence. This was orchestrated retribution. A system that punished women not by silencing them, but by erasing their children. RD sat down slowly. They did this because women started documenting what they saw, and the men in charge. They realized the only way to keep control was to make examples. He handed me a second envelope. "That's the second list. Those children were never found again. We only have numbers, no names." I opened it. It was short, just 17 digits. But each one represented a life stolen from records, from history, maybe even from existence. "Why now?" I asked him. "Why tell us this?" He looked out the window, then whispered, "Because I saw your face on that garage video, and I realized the next generation isn't afraid anymore. But we owe them the truth, before it dies with us." Suddenly, Anoija burst in. "We need to go. Now." There's a black sedan parked at the end of the street. No tags, 2 men. They've been there since we arrived. RD didn't panic. Instead, he smiled faintly and pointed to a hard drive already sitting in a sealed, padded envelope. "Everything's backed up. Take it. And Lorraine, don't trust internal channels. Go straight to Congress. Use media only after the hearing's secured." Then he paused. "Tell the truth. Not the version they taught you to survive with. The kind that burns before it heals." We left with the files, the drive, and the letter. The car was silent for a long time. Then Aiden finally said, "So what now?" And I looked at him and said, "Now? We light the match." They thought time would bury the evidence, that the witnesses would die, that the records would rot in quiet drawers. But memory doesn't disappear. Not when people are willing to bleed truth into the light. This isn't a story anymore. It's a reckoning, and I will burn the whole narrative down until those children are counted again. The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday. Special session. Closed chamber. 12 members of Congress. 1 mission. We had a 274-page dossier of redacted child records, a hard drive from RD's signed testimony from Gwen Selina, and 4 other survivors, and we had the letter from Charles Benton. But what we didn't have was why. Why did they go this far? Why create an entire category of punishment designed to erase the children of women who spoke up? We didn't get that answer until the night before the hearing. I was home. Rain on the window again. There's always rain when truth is close, I've noticed. Then Gwen called. Her voice was shaking. "Lorraine, someone just showed up at my door. His name is Julian Tress. He says he was Charles's roommate after the transfer." My heart stopped. Julian was 82, former government archivist, lived alone, had been watching the quiet archive unfold from afar, afraid to speak. But yesterday, he finally went into his attic and found something hidden beneath the floorboards of an old chest. 5 letters, written by Charles, never sent. All addressed to Gwen. The ink had faded in places, the paper brittle, but the words, they hit like thunder. "Gwen, if you're reading this, it means I failed. I tried to protect Aiden. I tried to shield you from what I saw. But the truth is, I was too slow. This system doesn't punish women like you because it fears you're wrong. It punishes you because it knows you're right. And if others ever believe you, the whole empire burns. Another letter. They created Category B not as a protocol, but as a deterrent. The message was simple: speak, and we take what you love most. And we make you watch us bury it in paperwork. In the final letter, he wrote, I left everything I could with RD, but the rest is on you. Not to fix what happened, but to make sure they never dare do it again. Gwen collapsed after reading the last one. And for the first time in months, I saw something different in her. Not just pain. The next morning we stood before Congress. 3 rows of media waited outside. A CNN reporter asked, Do you believe justice can come after this long? I didn't give her a headline. I gave her the truth. Justice doesn't age. It just waits for someone brave enough to go back for it. Inside, I laid down the first folder. Then another. Then another. By the time I was done, the table was full. And then I said, These aren't just documents. They're echoes. From a generation you never counted. And we are not asking for permission to remember them anymore. We are demanding protection, so it never happens again. When Adden took the stand, the room went silent. He didn't read from notes. He didn't shake. He just said, My mother told the truth. And for that, they tried to unwrite me. But I'm still here. And now the question is, how many more of us are out there, waiting to be remembered? When we left the chamber, Gwen walked beside me. She looked taller somehow. Not unbroken, but unafraid. Outside, someone had chalked a message on the sidewalk in blue. We were never missing. You just stopped looking. They tried to take my home, then my voice, then the history of hundreds like me. But what they couldn't take was our memory of each other. And now we speak not as victims, but as historians, of a truth they buried with purpose, and a justice we unearthed together. This concludes the story. Like, comment, and subscribe to Telling Story with Me, because sometimes the oldest scars hide the newest revolutions.